Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 610 through 612, which will cover manga chapters 684 through 686. And all hell starts to break loose as everyone is split up with their own objectives, but Caesar and his crew are proving to be very formidable adversaries. So, synopsis. Things in Punk Hazard have become completely chaotic as everyone is scrambling. Law and Smoker have to take down the tough Virgo, while Zoro is forced to face off against Monet to protect the kids and the other Straw Hats, as Mocha is doing her best to keep the candies away from the other kids. Down in the trash, Luffy has just run into a very interesting person that could change everything. Alright, so as differences go, there really aren't that many differences. A lot of scenes are kind of like slightly extended with a few extra seconds of footage, but I mean, they're not really big enough to mention specifically. The two that I kind of do want to mention is in Caesar's flashback, there are a couple extra scenes added, particularly towards the end where it's seen that the Marine soldiers come in to arrest Caesar, whereas in the manga, the soldiers have already apprehended Caesar, so they just added a couple extra scenes of this happening. Another one is the scene where the kids and the Straw Hats are stopped at the biscuit room by Monet. This happens a lot earlier in the manga, and it even happens even before Smoker gets to Virgo. But in the manga, it takes place just after Luffy falls. So it's just the timing in terms of this particular scene. But that's really it, if you could even qualify those two as like significant differences. But yeah, these three chapters were adapted pretty faithfully. Okay, so let's get into these episodes because these are pretty good ones, with Monet now blocking the Straw Hats' way and the kids become increasingly more frenzied. Robin finally reveals what favor Luffy had asked her to do back at the entrance, and it was to find a pair of sea stone handcuffs, but now that she needs to stay behind to restrain the kids, she asks Brook and Usopp to do it. No doubt Luffy's plan was to use them on Caesar so that they could capture him and restrain him later. After that brief scene, we get to the main event of Smoker versus Virgo. And I know you know my sort of misplaced love for Smoker, so at the time I was super hyped to see him actually get a big moment and a major fight. With this scene, especially with how Oda has built up Virgo in terms of his strength and his sort of hateability, and every word that comes out of his mouth makes you want to hate him even more. As just before the fight, Smoker is still looking after the well-being of his men by not revealing that Virgo had betrayed their trust, but Virgo just straight up says he already killed most of them and then rubs it in Smoker's face that he can do whatever I want to my good-for-nothing subordinates, which is pretty harsh. And I know it's pretty obvious the irony of how these two characters were written and designed and how it goes right along the central theme of the arc of not judging things immediately based on surface level appearances and statuses. Virgo, who has been presented as this incredibly kind, clean, put together appearance and friendly demeanor with a stellar reputation, is in fact the murderous and sadistic pirate, while the gruff, mean, and sort of Yakuza gangster looking Marine that looks more like a villain with a face scar and everything is actually the real kind and caring Marine. And this is, of course, another step in Smoker's journey, I believe, to eventually not necessarily turn on the Marines, but to be someone that will end up relenting by the end of the series that Luffy and the Straw Hats, despite their pirate label, are in fact good people, and that justice isn't as clear-cut as he once thought. It's definitely a character arc that I truly enjoy, but I wish it got more attention throughout the series. Oda seems to not have anything for Smoker to do most of the time, or even straight up forgetting about him most of the series. And later on, I feel like Tashigi actually gets more to do than Smoker does, but that's neither here nor there at the moment. We'll definitely get into that much, much later in the series when this starts to become a big glaring, I don't want to say issue, but a glaring subject matter. But I just want to say, I hope Smoker gets some sort of redemption after this arc, because, yeah, it's definitely, I want more from Smoker, but unfortunately, we're not going to get a lot of it later on. And speaking of Tashigi, though, she's going through the same sort of development as her superior, Smoker, as she's also coming to the same realization, but she seems to also still be caught up on labels and standing, as we see her yelling back at Sanji to stop being so friendly with her men and for her men to stop praising him and calling him Aniki, citing that he is still a pirate. And Sanji comes back with the thesis of what pirates and Luffy in One Piece are all about, in response to Tashigi saying that he is an enemy after all. And Sanji comes back with, that's just what society has determined about our relationship, but pirates are free. Which speaks to the point of the story and why pirates like Luffy and his view of the world is ultimately better than the way the world works as it is under the world government currently. He essentially says that the only reason that they're enemies is because society has deemed it so, even though they really don't have any real reason to be antagonistic towards each other. Sure, the Straw Hats have committed crimes by breaking laws that the world government have imposed, but they're not done, they haven't done anything outwardly evil or harmful to the innocent. And in fact, in Punk Hazard and Arabasta, they found themselves on the same side working together most of the time, both wanting to help people. However, because of these rigid views of labels and societal standings, it makes doing the right thing difficult for people like Smoker and Tashigi, as they have lamented quite a bit in the past, and when it would be far more efficient and beneficial to work together with pirates, but their strict laws won't allow them to do that, even if it would benefit and save hundreds, if not thousands more lives. However, pirates, on the other hand, because they're so free, they can choose to do whatever the heck they want, help or team up with whoever they choose and whenever they choose, which is why the Straw Hats have no issues teaming up with the Marines when it means helping others, and it allows them to do it freely. Similarly, they can team up with other pirates if they wanted to, even if they're also technically rivals or enemies. And of course, that freedom comes with a double-edged sword, as that amount of unrestricted freedom can also allow horrible people to do unspeakably evil things as well when they're unchecked. But the idea is to make those determinations of who's good and who's bad after you've seen who they really are, not based on their label or appearance. In this particular scene where the fire caused by the dragon earlier starts to cause explosions that creates gas leaks, Tashigi again sees something that contradicts her worldview, as just seconds after she scolds her men for idolizing Sanji for how cool he is, Sanji never says that he's a good guy, but he shows it with his actions by instead of saving just himself, which he could have easily just outrun the gas by himself, but instead he stays behind to not just help Tashigi, which to Tashigi wouldn't be all that surprising given she's witnessed his love of women. But even after, Sanji keeps angrily yelling at the men he has no interest in and still stays behind to save every one of them, showing something we've all known the entire series, that Sanji is incredibly kind to everyone and could never let innocent people die, which is definitely something Tashigi notices here. Granted, he goes about saving everyone in the most roughest way possible by booting them in the ass ahead like they were footballs. And which is pretty funny. But yeah, going back to Caesar for a minute though, one thing about Caesar's plan to have everyone funneled into and trapped in the R Tower that seems unintentionally stupid on his part, and I don't know if this was just something Oda didn't consider or something he actually baked into Caesar's character, is how he's already seen the Straw Hats are capable of cutting through his giant steel doors, so what's to stop them from doing that again? It just seems strange that he'd hinge his plans on eliminating his greatest threat on a plan that has already been proven to be ineffective against these people. But then again, this might be Oda writing into Caesar's character his own stupidity and short-sightedness and hubris with this scene. But I think it's more of a case of just like suspend your disbelief for the sake of the story type of thing. Because yeah, I mean, this plan is not very good considering that they've already shown that there's a counter to it. Like Zoro or even Law are capable of slicing through the door, and Kinemon to that matter. Now, speaking of this scene, when we see the flashback to when Caesar originally destroyed Punk Hazard with his first poison gas experiment, we actually get to see a bit of the real Vegapunk in the flesh in the anime, but it's a very generic looking scientist man from the chest down. However, in the manga, we actually get an interesting looking silhouette, which is something we don't get in the anime because this silhouette looks far from a normal looking standard man that we see in the anime. And when I reread this part after now having seen the real Dr. Vegapunk in the series in the most recent arc, I am honestly shocked at how accurate this manga silhouette is. It really does look like what he actually looks like. Usually Oda's early silhouettes are pretty off, especially the further out he introduces a character before they make their official appearance. And granted, Oda's original Vegapunk images were quite different, like the body shot we got of him when Kuma was explaining where he got his cyborg enhancements during the Thriller Bark arc when fighting Zoro. But this one here in Punk Hazard is definitely spot on. It was kind of a crazy revelation for me because it's been a while since I've gone back and reread Punk Hazard. So somewhere between Thriller Bark and Punk Hazard, Oda had determined what Vegapunk would look like and stuck to it, because even from here in chapter 684 till his official introduction in chapter 1066, a whopping 382 chapters and 10 years in real time from 2012 to 2022, it's still accurate. I'm not sure why I'm so excited or amazed about this, but I just find it crazy how consistent Oda was with this design, because most of the early silhouettes are hilariously off, like Jinbei or Big Mom, as well as the future reveal of Kaido. Kaido's silhouette is absurdly bad, like I've mentioned in the past. But yeah, this one was spot on from this point on. Now, once we move into episode 611, that's where we reconvene with Luffy as he's now stuck in the trash dump with none other than the son that Kinemon has been looking for, Momonosuke. And just like the little girl had mentioned to the henchman, he has in fact eaten a devil fruit that allows him to change into a dragon of all things, a pink one, which is actually very poetic considering his name. So in Japanese, when you want to call something pink, you can say pink iro, which is just the English word for pink. But another way that pink is commonly referred to as in Japanese is momoiro. Momo is Japanese for peach, and since peaches are often pink colored, they just call them momoiro, kind of like how we refer to oranges as, orange. And the fruit also being called orange. Interestingly enough, according to his Vivre card data book entry, one of his favorite foods is white peaches, not pink ones. His other favorite food is oden, which is sort of a Japanese style fish cake stew, being kind of the best way to describe it. And it's basically what Luffy eats a lot of in the first movie, if you've ever seen that. Now, there's also a character reason for this as well, why he likes oden so much. But seeing as how that's major spoilers, I won't say why. And in an SBS, Oda also mentioned that Momonosuke's name was inspired from Nakamura Kinnosuke, one of Oda's favorite Japanese actors who was a famous actor in his kabuki roles. The other potential inspiration for Momonosuke's name is that of Momotaro, who is a character in a famous Japanese folklore story, which I can't really dive too much into how this relates without spoiling future events. But needless to say, there are many loose similarities between the folklore story and Momonosuke's story. So you can basically see that Oda took Momotaro and Kinnosuke and mashed them together to get Momonosuke. And as we can see, Momonosuke for some reason still is in his dragon form, but Luffy, being hungry, immediately looks at him like he's his next meal. To me, this moment is very reminiscent of when he first met Chopper. The other funny moment to me here is that his initial thought instead of devil fruit was that he, like his dad, is also a butt attached to a dragon talking via farts, which is pretty funny. But then immediately attached to the idea that he's actually a talking eel, even though he's clearly a dragon. Momonosuke comes off like his father as an incredibly proud yet stubborn person who even comes off even more standoffish than Kinemon, being rude to all those kids who were just trying to be kind to him and sharing food with him, but he keeps refusing it just to uphold his samurai warrior pride, which eventually leads him to desperately and accidentally eating the mysterious devil fruit. For some reason, throughout the flashback, he's kept in a silhouette and his identity isn't shown. I never understood why Oda felt the need to hide his human identity, since it's revealed not too long from this moment, I feel like, towards the end of this arc, which is not that much longer. One shocking detail that we learn in this mini flashback is that Dr. Vegapunk at some point in the past created a man-made artificial devil fruit that was in some way a failure and had a defect, although we're not sure what that failure defect actually is as of right now. But the fact that someone was able to artificially create a devil fruit is huge. It looks like it works perfectly so far, even though we haven't seen it in action, but perhaps maybe it's defective because the user can't change back to its human form, was my original first thought after hearing this. And we will go on to learn what that defect of this fruit is much, much later on in the story. But there were so many theories about this development and what it could mean for the story going forward around this time. Like perhaps Vegapunk built a defective, fruit so that they couldn't be abused by the world government. Because at this point, Vegapunk seems to be a good guy, especially with this dichotomy of, or juxtaposition with Caesar. Because Caesar is, built up to be this evil scientist, whereas Vegapunk seems to always come out as the more compassionate and more sound of mind scientist compared to him. So it's really at this point hard to see Vegapunk as an evil scientist. If anything, at the worst, he's like a neutral one. But it's also here, Momonosuke drops even more info on us, telling us that Caesar's experiments on the kids are eventually going to kill them in 5 years, which angers not only Luffy, but also us, the readers and the viewers. Like, this guy has just gone so far in terms of the scum spectrum. He's not just some evil dude trying to do like a takeover or steal things. He is getting his jollies off, causing immense suffering to children, all under the guise of trying to help them. It really doesn't get much worse than that in terms of villainy. Like, this horrific villain motivation is just another instance of Oda taking his sort of darker themes and moments up a notch in the New World, which is a great in terms of raising the stakes of his writing. But I gotta say, this is yet another example of the poor pacing and clunkiness in Oda's writing in this arc. This scene, while it reveals a lot, just completely kills any and all momentum in the story, just so that he can do this massive exposition dump on, granted, really interesting and massively important information, but nonetheless, it doesn't change the fact that this moment really makes for an awkward placement. Granted, I don't know what the alternative to this would have been since I'm not a creative writer, but there had to be a better way of incorporating this information without grinding all the action and momentum of your climax to a sudden halt. Now, to cap off this scene, something really curious happens as Luffy is yelling at Momo to get it together. It sends Momonosuke into a panic attack as he has some sort of PTSD reaction to Doflamingo of all people, which means that Momo has actually seen or even met Doflamingo, and it wasn't a very pleasant experience from what it seems like. And to the point where it traumatized him, but this allows him to instinctively create his literal fight or flight reaction, and he begins to sort of fly by generating clouds and climbing up them, with Luffy holding on for dear life. And this interaction was very confusing at the time. I remember not thinking much of this, but I was very curious what this actually meant, but only time will tell on this one. I will say the little snippet we get of Smoker versus Virgo towards the end of episode 611 is gorgeous. It's one of those scenes where you can tell a lot of time and budget was rerouted to this moment, which, while it is a cool moment, I wonder why they felt this portion of the fight was significant enough to invest into, as its emotional weight and story significance is not all that important. If it wasn't clear already, Virgo is a legit powerhouse in terms of durability and strength. The fact that he's also unflinching in his demeanor throughout much of his appearances makes him that much more intimidating, which just adds to, or I should say, detracts from Caesar as a villain, like I mentioned in the past few podcast episodes. Virgo just presents a greater threat, and he's being fought by two characters that aren't even part of the Straw Hats. I personally don't care too much since I love both Smoker and Law, and particularly it's awesome to see Smoker in action, like I've been saying throughout this arc. But yeah, again, the issue here is that now that you know that both Virgo and Monet are actually both part of Doflamingo's crew, your mind starts to go towards the future as you wonder if these two are this powerful as we are about to see. And these aren't even his main guys, just how strong is the rest of Doflamingo's crew? And that's all you're thinking about by this point. You've gotten over Caesar and don't really care. He's just now an annoyance. He's become the annoying henchman more than the main villain. And we saw a very similar dynamic with Spandam and Lucci during Water 7 and Enies Lobby. But in that situation, the climax was in fact Luffy facing off against Lucci. That would be like if this situation was applied to that arc, it would be like if during Enies Lobby, Luffy, his end fight was versus Spandam, and the one to face and beat Lucci was like Polly, for example. While narratively, it could still make sense, it just wouldn't have been all that satisfying or as interesting. Unfortunately, we only get a snippet of the beginning of this fight, and we get back to the kids and the rest of the Straw Hats. This mini flashback with Mocha and the kids is heartbreaking to see. These kids are not only so innocent, but they're incredibly kind and empathetic. Like, there's a really small moment between Mocha and Sind as they're being transported to Punk Hazard, where we see Mocha crying her eyes out while Sind does his best to reassure and comfort Mocha. But eventually, you see Sin start to break down a little too. But that's when Mocha stops crying, and they both resolve to get through this, situation and their supposed illness together. It's this amazing level of empathy and kindness that both of them possess is what's so heartbreaking about all this. None of these children deserve any of this, especially, kids that are this good. It makes the following scene of Caesar and Monet just gaslighting and manipulating them so much more infuriating because all of the kids continue to be kind to one another and help each other as new kids continue to be brought to the island. It would be one thing if these kids were like snot-nosed brats, not that this kind of treatment of them would make it any more okay, but seeing just how purely good these kids are adds to that feeling of hoping Caesar and Monet get their asses handed to them just that much more stronger. Now, jumping from the sadness of the kids, we get back to the action as Monet and Zoro are going at it. And there's this one moment I thought was funny and interesting because it's another really small moment that kind of just gets lost, I feel like, in the shuffle. So Monet disappears into the snow and goes after Nami and Chopper as they're the weaker targets, and Zoro is seen charging at them. But since Nami can't see Monet, who's dove into the snow, it just looks like a really intense Zoro charging at full speed at them, which freaks Nami out and raises Chopper's squished face as a shield, which Chopper wholeheartedly objects to, which funny in and of itself, but Zoro makes it on time to stop Monet. But the little character moment I wanted to point out is that while Nami's initial instinct was to use Chopper as a shield to protect herself, when you see Zoro stop Monet's giant ice picks, you can clearly see Nami was going to actually sacrifice Chopper. And instead, when push came to shove, Nami actually moved Chopper out of the way and was ready to let Monet skewer her, which I feel like is an incredibly understated thing that can pass you by if you're not paying attention. Nami again follows that up with another really cool moment where she melts one of Monet's wings temporarily with her heat egg. And I think this scene is a really cool moment for Nami. It's a really small moment that if you're not paying attention can just like pass you by. It's like, oh, action scene. But it's a really cool character moment showing just, when it really comes down to it, Nami is a very brave and considerate person, especially of her crew. Zoro then allows the three of them to continue on, but Monet makes an observation that Zoro has only been defending and not attacking. And she, as well as us, the reader, begin to wonder if maybe like Sanji, Zoro also won't attack a woman, setting up an interesting scenario which I never really gave much thought to until I read this moment the first time, all those years back. We always knew that Zoro also had a bit of a chivalrous, yet also kind of sexist side to him when it came to women fighters. But it has never really been tested. The only time it ever really came up was in Logtown versus Tashigi in their first engagement, but he more or less just disarms her and leaves. And this moment is of course going to be referenced again in this very fight in the future episode, as we'll see Tashigi arrive at the end of this episode, leaving just Zoro and Tashigi to face off against Monet. And I remember wondering to myself, does Zoro have the same hangups about harming a woman as Sanji does? And will he basically rely on Tashigi to fight Monet? Unfortunately, we won't get to talk about this till the next podcast. But before that, Sanji himself, in a pretty hilarious scene, arrives, which sees him having all of the remaining G5 soldiers on board with him, telling them to make faces and mock Zoro as they pass by. And this scene kills me. And this scene goes from one ridiculous thing to the next, as obviously Sanji goes full-on nosebleed mode at the beauty of Monet, along with the Marines, and for some reason Monet is seen responding and becoming all bashful to all the compliments, with Zoro yelling at her, "Also, why are you so weak to compliments?" And this doesn't last long though, as she viciously attacks one of the soldiers, biting off their shoulder. With Tashigi now arrived and committed to stay behind and fight Monet alongside Zoro, telling him that she believes she's needed there, referencing that very moment from Logtown, as she also feels that Zoro is unwilling to attack a woman based on their previous interaction. As I said, this was an intriguing situation because Up till now, it seems like Zoro has zero qualms about hurting women, but the only example of Zoro actually harming a woman up till now was Miss Monday when he made her pass out by squishing her head and I would presume cutting off like blood flow, maybe. But even then, he never actually cut her with his swords. So perhaps it's that he'll never use his swords on women, or this is just a misconception born out of non action? I mean, we'll definitely get more into this on the next podcast episode when the actual proper fight goes on. But yeah, that's where we'll leave this episode. If you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider liking and subscribing. Check out my Instagram at SunnyGo Podcast for updates of when I post new episodes, to see some pictures on my manga collection and One Piece card collection. And yeah, just listening to the podcast is enough for me in terms of your support. But if you feel like supporting me, please feel free to support via the Buy Me a Coffee profile found on my podcast webpage. But nothing is required whatsoever. And as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to my podcast. There will be actually somewhat of a significant spoiler section because there are quite a few things that are referenced in this episode that play major roles later on in the series. So I want to talk about a lot of those. But if you're not interested in that, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye! All right, so spoiler section. So there are quite a few things to talk about, like I mentioned in the non-spoiler section. Again, this is not as scripted as the spoiler section or the non-spoiler section, so this is going to be more just free form. But yeah, there's a few things that I want to talk about. One thing, you can really start to see Caesar hamming it up in the scene where he talks to his men about the Shinokuni gas and to make sure that they're still loyal to him. And this moment really made me realize that, yeah, Caesar really loves his theatrics. And this is where we see his love for future disguises like the Gastino or the Medicine Man come up later on, where he's like multiple different personas. Like, he is a very good actor in terms of like manipulating people. Like we see it with like the kids. We've seen it with his men. Like, Caesar is very like theatrical in terms of his acting prowess, and so this is kind of like interesting to see him now, and then we see him like get more elaborate with his disguises later on in the series. So yeah, the Momonosuke and Momotaro similarities, it's pretty undeniable. Like a famous character in a folklore story, and he's headed to an island that's also called Onigashima with his allies to defeat a group that was oppressing people. While Momotaro fights ogres, Momonosuke technically fights pirates, but like, between the numbers and even Kaido himself is kind of ogreish. And so, yeah, the similarities there are also very, very like apparent. And Momonosuke being aided by an ally whose ability is to tame animals with dango also matches how Tama eventually turns the tides of the entire war by using her ability, the dango ability, to control all the gifters. So yeah, the story of Momotaro is definitely an inspiration because it has too many similarities not to be. There's another interesting scene when Momonosuke doubts Luffy is a pirate. He describes what his image of an actual pirate is, and while at the time those words can just be taken as he's describing just generally what people would normally associate as scary pirates, but upon rewatch, he's actually describing Kaido to a T, which is what he most closely associated with as pirates, since to him, the events of Kaido taking over Wano and killing his father happened just mere days ago. And so this is a very fresh memory on his mind. So when he imagines what a pirate should be, he thinks Kaido and not Luffy. The other thing that was really cool too, that we just learned not too recently ago, was in Egghead Island, we learned that the defect of Momonosuke's Uo no Mi, like the man-made version, the only defect was that it was pink and not blue. It was and the funny thing is like a lot of people, including myself, kind of predicted that it would be something stupid, because especially after you started seeing how Momonosuke would use the fruit power, like it didn't seem like there was anything wrong with it. And pretty quickly, a lot of people started to theorize that it's probably something really stupid and benign. And it turns out that was exactly correct. It was the fact that Vegapunk is such a perfectionist that he viewed that it coming out pink was a major defect rather than it coming out blue like the original fruit. Which I think for most people would be like, who cares? You have the power of a Seiryu dragon or an Azure dragon. You should not care. This is effective as hell, especially when compared to Caesar's sort of terrible, the smile fruits. Like those are just hideously ineffective, I feel like. The other funny thing to come out of this moment with Momonosuke and Luffy is that the line where Luffy tells Momo to turn back into a human, and Momo just shocked yells back, "How do I do that?" And Luffy saying, I don't know, I'm not a zone type, is pretty hilarious after the events of Wano. Because it turns out Luffy is in fact secretly a zone type devil fruit user. So he was lying at this moment. Which is really funny to see now that we know he's actually the possessor of the Hito no Mi model Nika zone type fruit, which is, it's an insane revelation. But yeah, and it's funny too. I don't even know if it's hard to tell if Oda actually had that in mind and he threw this joke in there, or if the Nika fruit thing came out sometime after this. I have to think that maybe that this was actually a intentional joke, because I don't know how you go through the series by this point and not have that in mind because of all the different sort of clues that have been dropped. But yeah, still, nonetheless, it's a very funny line upon rewatch. The last kind of spoiler thing I wanted to talk about is that sort of random flash of Doflamingo where Momo has kind of that PTSD recollection. And I gotta say, I was hoping for a lot more with this when I first read it. I thought it was going to be a lot more significant, but it's kind of just glossed over, really. It references a time where that he recounts in chapter 725 or episode 658 about witnessing Doflamingo torture one of the Colosseum warriors before he got split up with Kinemon. And that memory of Doflamingo just being really cruel to this guy is the genesis of this sort of PTSD moment. And it just feels like, for an 8-year-old child, that would be pretty freaking scary to see Doflamingo, this like giant man who's just torturing another person in this like very creepy laugh, like, and so, yeah, I can see how that would be a PTSD moment. But I think for me, I was hoping that it would be a lot more of a major thing. The way this is portrayed in this moment, it just seems like something huge, like that really affected Momo, but really wasn't. It's just, I don't know. I'm not sure what Oda's sort of motivation for this scene was. It just didn't seem like it was just underwhelming in terms of like how big it was set up to be, and it turning out to be really not that much. It was just a kid scared of a villain, like not that big of a deal, I feel like. But yeah, anyways, that's pretty much all the spoiler stuff I wanted to talk about. So yeah, there was a lot in this episode in this set of episodes. And I think going forward, yeah, there will be more and more things, because now we're really into that sort of the Wano saga or the Emperor saga, where we see all these from Punk Hazard, Dressrosa, Zou, Whole Cake Island, and all the way up to Wano. This entire set of episodes is just one big story, and so things start to build upon each other. So we'll start to get more and more spoiler stuff, I feel like, as we go on. But anyways, this episode's getting a little bit long, so I wanted to end it there, and I hope to see you on the next episode, and thanks for listening. Bye.